Hi, everyone. Thank you for being with us. And a very special thank you for distinguished guests. We are really looking forward to learning your insights on Kurds political struggles. My name is Aydin Ulu, and I'm the Communications Director at Middle East and North Africa Club at SAIS. And as the club, we are excited to host this event. Before we begin, I would like to introduce our club. The Middle East and North Africa Club is a student-led organization for those with connections to the region and for those who have interest in the region. And we aim to create educational, social, and professional programming. We engage in regional issues with depth and nuance. Tomorrow, we have an event on Yemen crisis at SAIS tomorrow in collaboration with the Conflict Management Club. So this event will run for about an hour, and we will reserve time for audience questions. So please go ahead and submit your questions in the chat. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Lisel Hintz, Assistant Professor of International Relations at International Relations and European Studies at SAIS. She will be our moderator and take us from here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Aydin. Thank you so much to the SAIS MENA Club, to Samin, to Hayden, to Aydin, to everyone who has worked so hard to put together a really fantastic roster of events. It has been my pleasure to be the faculty advisor. This is my last event I'm moderating. We've had fantastic events on Tunisia, on Lebanon, on women's political participation, on newsmaking in Syria and Turkey. And now it is really my pleasure to be able to sort of round off my contribution as moderator with this panel, one that is near and dear to my heart. And I am really honored to have such a truly distinguished panel of guests with me, and specifically to be able to elevate Kurdish voices when we're talking about Kurdish issues, something that is very important to the SAIS MENA Club and something that's important to me as well. So I will go ahead and introduce our speakers. I'll start off with a couple of rounds of questions. Please do put your questions in the chat, and then we will go ahead and incorporate those. So again, this being able to talk on this issue, I think, is a really important one for me. I just want to mention before we introduce the speakers, we often hear about, Kurds rightly described as the largest ethnic minority in the world without a state of their own. But I think sometimes the many differences and varieties of splits between languages and religion and religiosity and political ideology and national experience and political goals get overlooked a bit. And so we have this opportunity to hear from 4 experts, each with a regional specialty. So again, thanks for joining us. So to introduce those distinguished speakers, we have first Sirwan Kajo, who is a journalist for Voice of America. He is a political analyst with expertise on Syria and Kurdish issues, a research analyst who's also published 2 book chapters on the topic. We have Dr. Dilan Okçuoğlu, who is a postdoctoral fellow and professorial lecturer at American University, who works on Turkey and the Kurdish issue, and specifically experiences within Turkey's borderlands and Kurdish borderlands. We have Shukriya Bradost, who is a Ph.D. candidate at Virginia Tech University, a political analyst and frequent commentator on Persian and Kurdish media. And then we also have, last but certainly not least, looking very distinguished, we have in his tie, Dr. Bilal Wahab, who is the Nathan and Esther K. Wagner Fellow at the Washington Institute of Near East Policy and an expert on Iraq and Kurdish affairs in Iraq. So thanks to all of you for joining us today. So to kick off the discussion, I just wanted to start off with a very broad question that will allow you to sort of bring up any of the dynamics of the country that you're speaking to in your opening remarks. I just want to sort of ask about how you would characterize the current state of political struggles of Kurds in Syria, Iraq, Iran, Turkey. Sort of what are the major obstacles that are being sort of dealt with so far, or sort of how would we look at that set of dynamics today, just to kick it off. So Bilal, I'm going to start with you. In terms of Kurds who have had the most political progress, in terms of those who've been able to sort of establish governance, obviously you've written quite a lot on this. This is your area of expertise. Can you kind of kick off what that governance looks like, what that experience has been for the Kurds, what some of those challenges are?
Well, first of all, thank you, Lisel, so much for hosting this event. I think it's very timely, and I'm also pleased to be joined by fellow Kurds and fellow experts, Dilan, Sirwan, and Shukriya. And of course, my thanks is also extended to the SAIS MENA Club. That's, I think, an excellent question to kick off this conversation with. As you pointed out, Iraqi Kurds, in terms of political rights, have managed to gain the greatest amount of political and cultural rights from the central government in the broader story of Kurdish statelessness. But this kind of achievement is also contrasted by Iraqi Kurds also having suffered the most at the hand of the Iraqi government, the country where they have been attached, and that was obviously culminated in the use of poisonous gas in Halabja. And of course, an extended Anfal campaign that was a genocide campaign. The peak, perhaps the precursor, the main event, was Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait in 1990, and then the uprisings in Kurdistan and the uprisings in southern Iraq. So 1992 was a watershed moment for Iraqi Kurdistan, where the no-fly zone was put in place by the United Nations, became a safe haven for Kurdistan. And in May, actually, the first Kurdish election took place where the Kurdistan regional government was elected. That government kind of managed to run the three northern provinces, which became Iraqi Kurdistan region. But I think most importantly was the post-Saddam era, which brought about very important and perhaps monumental, and by Middle Eastern standards, but definitely compared to the other Kurdish regions, monumental opportunities for Iraqi Kurds. A new government was put in place. The Kurdish parties were key to the opposition in diaspora. They were close friends to the West, to the United States, to the United Kingdom, the two main powers that toppled the Saddam Hussein regime. And the Kurds also found unity. So thanks to those historical relations with the West and newly found Kurdish unity at home, when a new constitution for Iraq was drafted in 2005, the Kurds were ready. They enshrined political rights. Kurdistan became a region within a federal Iraq. They enshrined linguistic, like cultural rights. The Kurdish language was recognized as a formal language in Iraq, and many other rights, including the principles of self-governance and autonomy, including financial management, including oil and gas management. These rights, which I said include self-governance at its core, gave the KRG, an opportunity to stand out, to develop, to bring about economic prosperity, to further its own foreign policy. And of course, it perhaps also helped for the KRG to stand out as the rest of Iraq, the rest of the country, went through a turmoil of civil war, sectarian strife, etc. However, these Kurdish rights are not as good as the constitution makes them sound, because the reality is more complex. Briefly, Kurdish aspirations in Iraq were greater than just federalism. The Kurds aspire for independence, and they put that aspiration to test in a referendum in 2017. I think a second point here is that Kurdish rights that I mentioned were enshrined in the constitution, but they hinge on two main principles: one, democracy; two, rule of law. And today, both are lacking. Iraq lacks in those two departments. The respect for the constitution at best is very selective. And this goes both for Erbil and Baghdad. And then probably another point, on the constitutionality and selectiveness, you have Article 140 about disputed territories that's completely ignored. And then you have other articles about oil management, which KRG and Baghdad interpret really according to balance of power, not so much according to the letter of the word. There are also security challenges, the latest of which was ISIS that occupied a third of the country in 2014, 2017. But then nowadays you have drone attacks, rocket attacks from militias. And I think most crucially, now you have regional powers interfere and attack Kurdistan. You have an ongoing Turkish incursion, which is almost seasonal. We have a new wave that is starting. And then you have Iran targeting Erbil with cruise missiles. And then, of course, probably a last point here, Lisel, in the absence of a Kurdish vision for a future Kurdistan, parties today, the Kurdish parties, the two main Kurdish parties in Iraqi Kurdistan, are more consumed with internal dynamics. Today is very difficult for even analysts and experts to put their fingers on what is the vision for the future, what is the way forward, having this kind of recent history that I went through. But we have at least a couple of standing points. Whenever the relation between the parties are good, Kurdistan can make strides forward. Whenever the relation internally is bad, when Kurdish KRG institutions are weak and personalized, and stories of corruption emerge, and the people basically get disillusioned with the quality of governance at home, then Kurdish aspirations in Iraq also take many, many steps back.
Thank you so much for that. I think that's laying some great groundwork for us in terms of thinking about how there can be steps forward, steps back, how having something legislated, having something in a constitution doesn't necessarily mean that it's carried out to the letter on the ground. So I think that's a great way to kick it off. So Dilan, I want to turn to you on this. So with Turkey and the Kurdish issue, we have a little bit more of a mixed bag. We have Turkish the People's Democratic Party passing the parliamentary majority or parliamentary threshold for the first time in 2015. So they've made a lot of strides, but at the same time, there's also been quite a lot of political repression that we've seen. So how would you characterize sort of the main political challenges to the Kurdish movements today?
Yeah, thank you, Lisel. That's a good question. And I think Bilal put the picture quite well. Both in terms of domestic politics of Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan, but also regional dynamics that also have impact, of course, on Turkish-Kurdish relations. So let me just briefly say a couple of things related to the first question that you posed. It's going to be a very brief introduction because it directly relates to what I'm going to say about HDP and the potential challenges, political and institutional challenges that have been implemented and enacted for years and years within the state apparatus of Turkey, especially in their treatment of course, Kurds, which is the biggest stateless nation and also territorially concentrated and politically mobilized group of people living along the borders of Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria, also within the larger hinterland. But that's I think the heart of the land, I would say, the territory, especially in Kurdish imagination, right? So the point of statelessness, of course, is important. But I think when we talk about Kurdish politicization in Turkey, I would like to underline the fact that there are institutional barriers. For instance, one of the very well-known scholars writing on India, I think Chandran, right, in 2005, he looks at the relationship between ethnic diversity and the quality of democracy in place. Because we know there are several languages and ethnic groups in India. That's why India is given as an example of federalism. There are different forms of federalism as well, symmetric versus asymmetric, and so on and so forth. But India is usually given as an example for more like a success story, even if there are certain local, of course, problems. In general, we can say that. So what is this relationship between ethnic diversity and democracy? There are scholars who claim that ethnic diversity is the biggest threat to the quality of democracy, especially in divided settings like Turkey and also Iraq and Iran and Syria. However, Chandran argues that it is not ethnic diversity per se, which is the biggest challenge to democracy. or maintenance and sustainability of democracy. However, it is the institutional arrangement, institutional setting that these groups have been politicized or keeps bargaining on political, social, and cultural rights. Right. So, what is this institutional setting in Turkey? It is, of course, the unified nation state. We go back to the collapse of Ottoman Empire and the establishment of Turkish Republic in 1923. And since then, we see that even there were some ruptures because of state suppression and some internal issues going on, like group rivalries, competition, political fragmentation, quote unquote. But at the end of the day, we see that there's a kind of continuity in terms of Kurdish resistance and mobilization in Turkey against state oppression. In my writing, I usually call it state control, ethnic control. And this ethnic control regime has its own dynamics. For instance, electoral voting threshold has been one of the biggest barriers. And we know that 10% threshold is pretty high. There are thresholds in other countries like Germany. There is 5% threshold, or the other countries as well. But 10 or 3%, 6%, but 10% is very high. And we know that this threshold has been in place to prevent Kurds from gaining any parliamentary seats so that they would be politically represented within the legal domain of politics, right? So the other challenge, but again, I wanted to think of these minor points within the larger framework of all these institutional barriers. So there's ethnic control regime in place, and that ethnic control regime is being maintained and sustained by use of political control, territorial control, electoral control, cultural control, economic control. Okay, so we can give lots of different examples under each of these subtitles. But at the end of the day, they will all imply the fact that there are institutional barriers that make the unified Turkish nation state fail to accommodate Kurdish rights in Turkey. And of course, the other challenge, I would say, because we are in 2022 and the AKP ruling party has been in place for 2 decades now, since 2002 that they came to power, we have to talk about democratic backslide, right? When they came to power, especially the first stage of their governance, we saw that they got so much support from liberal intellectuals or certain other political actors who wouldn't normally support AKP only because there was this wave over popular discourse of Europeanization that would, in theory, give more rights to Kurds, or at least they would accommodate Kurds to some extent. However, it didn't happen. Yes, there was a Kurdish opening or the so-called democratic initiatives, but it failed. And then in 2015, July 2015, ceasefire ended between the PKK and the Kurdish state, and violence came back. So democratic backsliding in Turkey led to the rise of competitive authoritarianism. So now we cannot talk about the coexistence of control and democracy, I think, because the domain or the space that is given to democratic norms, quote unquote, which was actually at the surface level, was also limited, shrank significantly in the last 5 to 6 years, or even longer, I would say. And the final point, of course, I talked about intergroup rivalries, but I would like to come back to that in the second round. It also speaks to, I think, what Bilal has already mentioned, because it has its own implications about the broader regional actors, including Iran, and I'm pretty sure Shukriye will touch on that. Its role in Syria, and of course, Shirwan will talk on that. But Iran, I think, has a role in Turkey as well, which is significantly neglected. So why most of the progressive actors in Turkey ignore to talk about the role of Iran, especially when we talk about Turkish-Kurdish relations? So what kind of role could Iran play in Turkey? There are some of the questions that I will ask more, but I will leave it aside for now. So the final point is HDP. So what is new about HDP, right? Yes, HDP is the continuum of previous Kurdish parties, pro-Kurdish parties, which dates back to early 90s, right? HEP. I think there are 8 or 9 parties, right? HDP, HEP. I can confuse the order, okay? Because they're all shut down by the state, and they were all accused for supporting terrorism. And they are links to the PKK, Kurdish militancy, insurgency. So HDP, yes, again, it is the continuum of previous organizations. However, we have to remember one point. Neither PKK nor HDP are monolithic organizations. We have to think of them more like fields, dynamic fields or domains that include different actors who could support leftism, but also Kurdish nationalism. But the main difference with HDP, I would say, is the fact that, this is the final point, before I wrap it up, I think there's kind of rupture, because I will make a claim and I would like to discuss this, because I was waiting for some others to raise this, especially in the last couple of years, but because HDP politicians are always being imprisoned and they are tortured, of course, it's hard to say some of these things. I know that. However, I think it is also fair to talk about the successes and failures of HDP itself in terms of Kurdish representation. It's obvious that HDP is the end product of ongoing negotiations between different actors who claim to represent Kurds in Turkey. However, in certain occasions, HDP itself has acted more like a centripetalistic force that also motivates Kurds to move sometimes from margins towards the center. And we know that because when we look at the literature, we see that there are scholars like Horowitz and others who claim that we shouldn't have any ethnic dominant party in countries like Turkey that are ethnically divided and pluralistic. This is a controversial point, and I will come back to that. But yes, again, people are being imprisoned, they are tortured, and there's a very limited space for Kurdish representation in the legal domain. But we have to think about all the pros and cons if we would like to help Kurds to have a vision that would bring further achievements, but not sacrifices anymore. Thank you.
Dilan, I really appreciate your comments, and I appreciate you incorporating those academic perspectives and sort of sharing with us what the expectations for what ethnic diversity can do and sort of what are some of the constraints vis-a-vis democracy, what are the opportunities. So I'm going to turn to Shukriya, because I think what is interesting that's coming up is sort of this disconnect between what is law and what is in practice. And so with Dilan, we just heard, for example, about the Constitutional Court's closing of a succession of Kurdish parties, including a closure case right now against the HDP. We heard about the parliamentary threshold, 10%, largest in the world, moves to move that down now, but with the AKP's own political considerations in mind. So you've written, interestingly, on sort of how there are, so when elections come up, for example, when the presidential election last year, there will be overtures to let's, increase the space for linguistic rights. Let's adhere to the Constitution and allow for mother languages speaking and so forth. So I'm very interested to sort of get your take on the state of the Kurdish struggle, how these issues may be touched on strategically, politically during elections, but then you see a very different story on the ground. So please.
Thank you, Lisel, and it's really a privilege to be part of this event. Actually, allow me to begin by explaining why Iranian Kurdish struggle is have some differences with other part of the Kurdistan struggle. Iran is the most ethnically diverse country in the Middle East. The rate of the ethnic diversity in this country is larger than the average of the Middle East. That make an Iran case for the ethnic right is a unique case. And also Kurds in Iran, unlike Kurds in Iraq, Turkey, Syria, they are not the first largest ethnic minority in this country. They are second largest minority after the Azeri Turks. And also there is a in Iran, it wasn't part of the Ottoman Empire. Iran is, we know, is a switch from the multi-millennial empire to the nation state. And I can say with the starting establishment of the nation state in Iran in 1925, it was a beginning of a suffering and struggle of ethnic group in this country. They don't talk about how dominant theory, they talk about when one ethnic control all the countries in the diverse ethnic groups country will be suffering for other ethnic groups. So in Iran, this kind of the theory in political science is really the best theory to talk about the Iran diversity. When in this theory, it says when one nation state established based on the identity of majority ethnic group, so other ethnic group will be a threat to that majority ethnic group. Like when Iranian nation state established in 1925, Persian identity became the idea of this country. And this identity became the administration identity. And the other ethnic groups of identity become a threat to that institutional identity. And dominant theory says when these majority ethnic groups identity become the idea of the country, so their identity will be vanished. They don't consider themselves as ethnic groups anymore. So it is what we see in Iran when we're talking about ethnic groups. The Persian, they don't consider themselves as an ethnic group. They call themselves as Iranian. So that's a part of the differences between Iran and other countries. Also, there is a tactic or a strategy, the way Iran suppress Kurds in this country that have a unique strategy, actually. One of them is killing most strong leaders of the Kurds. That tactic haven't been used by other parts, or they haven't been successful to using that tactic. It's called Machiavellian's plan in the political science. When you kill the leader of the movement, for that movement to remobilize and reorganize, it will take a time. And with killing the leaders, you're weakening that movement, which is what happened in Iranian Kurds when they kill Qasimlu and Dr. Qasimlu and Sharaf Kandi. They assassinate this leader of the KDPI in Europe, when they had a negotiation to peacefully find a solution for future of the Kurds in this country. And there are a lot of different strategy Iran used. And I just trying to make a few of them in this event because of the short time we have here. One of them is a media restriction. All the Iranian national media and the newspaper, they're not allowed to talk about the ethnic groups, grievances, ethnic groups topics. And even the foreign correspondents in Iran, they're not allowed to visit ethnic groups regions. There are examples. For example, there is a shutdown of Al Jazeera's office in Tehran in 2005, when Al Jazeera just had a report about the Arab ethnic groups in Iran. Or there was another example of Guardian journalist who was exploited from Iran because he just visited the Baluchistan region, which is ethnically Baluch people live there. So the only time that the media will talk about the ethnic group or the privatization of ethnic group is during the time, the election. I'm sure you read my article about that. It published on Jazeera. It says during the presidential election, there is that campaign. Everybody will talk about how ethnic groups is suffering in this country, and how ethnic groups region are most undeveloped and securitized region. And this is just for a short time, for sure, because they want to achieve the ethnic groups vote for the election. We know almost half of the Iranian population, they are coming from the ethnic groups. We don't have an accurate number about the ethnic composition in Iran, but based on the majority inhabited city by Kurdish people, we can say Kurds have a Kurdish population estimate between 10 to 12 million people. Like Azeris, more than 20 million people in this country. So with this number, you can see that ethnic group is actually almost half of the population of this country. So they need that vote during the election. And after election, all this ethnic struggle, ethnic separation will be vanished from all media. And another time they may use ethnic groups, culture or language when they have an occasion, they use it as an entertainment actually. I feel it like this even disrespectful of the ethnic groups when they call them on the TV as a local folklore for dancing, for culture, to see them as an entertainment for the rest of the country. That's the only time. And there are other restrictions for the legal, for the education system. For the legal, I can say, like Dylan talked about how HDP has a that right or decent, they don't allow Kurds to have, but in Iran, even having ethnic, having political party based on ethnic group is a ban. If you are a candidate in political race and you even win the election and you talk about the ethnic group, we had that case in Iran in 1998 and during the 2000, this time when one parliament member, he talked about his ethnicity, he terminated from the parliament. So it doesn't matter if you talk about even your ethnicity, you will be banned from the political participation. And in education, there is a huge assimilation strategies going on in education. I'm giving just one example because there is a bunch of examples if I want to talk about it. One of example is interesting when the kids, Kurdish or other ethnic group kids, they register to primary school because we have mother tongue in Iran is being banned to learn and to teach. If you register your 5-year, 6-year kids to the school, and if they cannot talk in Persian, they will be registered as a disabled student. They will categorize as a disabled student. It is just one example to see what's going on in the education system. And in my last point for that part, I want to talk about the power sharing. My own research about the ethnic composition and Iranian formal power, my result shows that 94% of these people who are in the formal power in Iran, they are Persian, and less than 2% they are Kurds. And even that 2% of Kurds, they are Shia Kurds. In Iran, we have a majority Sunni Kurds and minority Shia Kurds. And I can come back to this part and explain how even these Shia Kurds, now the ethnic awareness in Iran, which happened between 2004 and 2005, changed this opinion among the Shia Kurds, and they have a more sympathy for the ethnicity more than the religious. And I will stop here and let's come back to my point with the more detail about the Kurds' own struggle in this country. Thank you.
Excellent. This is so rich in content. Thank you so much. All right, Shirwan, we are turning to you, to the Syrian case. So what are the sort of main challenges? We've seen some opening of opportunities and some implementations of models around democratic autonomy, regional autonomy, experimental democratic governance. What does that look like in Syria now? Is this opportunity something that looks like it can spread? Obviously, the Syrian civil war is playing a gigantic role in that. So we've got lots of different levels of dynamics going on in Syria, as well as the other cases. Please.
Right. Thank you, Lisel, and thank you, the SAIS MENA Club, for putting together this wonderful panel. It's very timely indeed. Unlike the Kurdish questions in Iraq, Turkey, and Iran, the Kurdish question in Syria has only came to prominence in the last decade or so, particularly after the eruption of the Syrian civil war, and later on after the rise of the Islamic State terror group and the role that the Kurds have been playing in combating that group and their partnership with the US-led coalition. But from a legal and political perspective, there's always been a Kurdish question in Syria. In fact, since the establishment of the modern state in the 1920s, and more so after the country gained independence from France in 1946, successive governments since then have carried out different anti-Kurdish policies. The goal is to eliminate Kurdish political participation in political life in Syria. By that, they have banned the Kurdish language. They have prevented the Kurds from going to school in the early years of the Syrian conflict, of the Syrian state. And these policies have manifested themselves in after the unfolding of the Syrian war, in a sense that Kurds have always felt marginalized and saw themselves as an oppressed minority. And then suddenly, with the eruption of the civil war, they were given the opportunity not only to govern themselves and their regions, but also to expand their territory into non-Kurdish non-traditionally Kurdish territory, which brings me to your question about autonomy and Kurdish experiment in that regard. It's in fact that has been elevated over the past several years, in the sense that you not only have no experience in governing your region, but you also have the responsibility to fight on different fronts. As we speak right now, Kurds have to deal with Damascus and constant demands from Damascus, concessions that Kurds have to make almost on a daily basis. You still have ISIS very active in parts of eastern Syria, particularly in the Deir ez-Zor province. The most recent example was the prison break attempt in Hasaka in January this year, which was foiled, of course. But that shows how active and how dangerous ISIS still is. And also, on the other hand, you have Turkey and the Turkish-backed groups in parts of the Kurdish heartland that also pose a very, very real danger in the Kurdish attempt to establish this nascent autonomous region that we, of course, can talk later about how it evolved over the years since 2012 and how it devolved in certain aspects. But right now, that very experiment is at risk because as the Syrian war is dwindling, all these forces are trying to come back to the Kurds, because to a certain degree, the regime, as it was preoccupied with other battles in more strategic regions, probably in areas like, Homs, Aleppo, and the suburbs of Damascus, now that these are reclaimed by the Syrian government and their allies, they're trying to come back and reestablish themselves in the Kurdish region. Same thing goes to the Turkish-backed opposition that has been trying to, make advances and inroads in Kurdish regions, particularly in areas that have been occupied by Turkey and its proxies, namely Afrin and Seregani, Ras Lain, and other places in northwest and northeast Syria.
Thank you so much for that. All right, we're going to try and get another round in, and I'm going to start incorporating some of those audience questions. So Bilal, we're going to turn back to you. So we have a question on the 2017 referendum. And the student wants to know, or the audience member wants to know, sort of, how do we explain why this decision was made? Was there a belief that this was going to be accepted in terms of the referendum? And then I'd also wanted to ask, sort of, how does post-referendum, how does the situation between Erbil and Baghdad post-referendum, how has that changed? And how does that shape Kurdish political opportunities? So giving you a lot to take on there.
Excellent questions, Lisel. And I mean, perhaps I alluded to it earlier that the main Kurdish grievance is statelessness, and therefore, at the core and the heart of all of the different Kurdish political movements that all of us went through is to right that wrong that was perpetrated against the Kurds. That kind of historical injustice. Now, the Iraqi Kurds, as I said, they got closest to it, and they took a shot at it. Part of it was because of this kind of legacy and history, and there is also like tremendous, political, kind of history-making points for anyone who could further that cause. So, we cannot be kind of blind to that kind of legacy-making aspect and how alluring that would be to political leaders. So that is, I think, kind of two dimensions. But on the ground, then, like, why 2017 and why not earlier or later, or the question of the timing, I think in particular at the time, the main champion was the Kurdistan Democratic Party and its leader, Mr. Masoud Barzani, who basically saw an opportunity. They read the tea leaves. Iraq was failing, had lost a third of its territory to ISIS. Militarily, it was a significant failure for Iraq. So that kind of exposed how weak Iraq was. And, the Kurds were kind of making an easier case that, we're not separating from some stable country. We are seceding from a country that's dragging us down. So that was kind of one argument. The other argument was, some Iraqi leaders have adopted some punitive measures against Kurdistan, cutting budgets, and at some point, an Iraqi prime minister threatened to use F-16s against the Kurds. So that kind of dispute, the aspiration of the constitution that I mentioned, and then when the kind of reality hit, the difference between the aspirations and the reality were so stark that the Kurdish calculation basically shifted more toward independence. And I think another probably factor that encouraged the Kurds was this experience with self-governance on the one hand, but also establishing enough of an international reputation and a regional network that they thought that they could get away with it. So, for example, the Iraqi Kurds thought that Turkey would be game because Turkey has been proving very important for the KRG's ability to export oil despite Baghdad's disapproval. And they thought that oil nationalism and oil interest, and of course tying, like oil was used mainly as a geopolitical tool, that if you have American companies and British companies and Turkish pipeline companies and oil companies, then therefore people being regional countries and Western countries will have an interest in supporting and maybe even protecting an independent Kurdistan. Now, of course, Mike Tyson says everyone has a plan until they get punched in the nose. Unfortunately, the reality was that punch in the nose. All of these assumptions were unraveled, and they were not in favor of Kurdistan, of Iraqi Kurdistan and Kurdish aspirations. I think in part because it exposed Kurdish wounds. There were things that were known, let's say, to Kurdish, analysts and observers, but I think the referendum made those, those governance deficiencies very bare. So, for example, the bane of Kurdish politics is internal division, but that was not just an academic topic anymore. The rivalry and disagreement between KDP and PUK was one of the main reasons why the referendum failed. The Peshmerga could not fight back the coming Iraqi army and the militia because they did not have unity of command. They were answering to political parties, Kurdish political parties, rather than answering to a Kurdish government. And of course, this came after the stellar experience of the Kurdish Peshmerga in fighting ISIS. So against ISIS, there was a greater level of unity of command against a common enemy. But when it came to the referendum, the KDP and the PUK had different incentive structures. And the Kurdish economy proved not to be resilient. When the Iraqi government cut the KRG share of the budget, the Kurdish economy tanked. And therefore, that was also kind of a rude awakening. All of the geopolitical investment in the region, in the West, did not prove to be as valuable as the Kurdish leadership has imagined. They used oil as a geopolitical tool in the mindset of the 70s and the 80s, looking at Saudi Arabia or Kuwait, because they have oil, anything that happens to them, they get protected. But, this was the 21st century, and the geopolitical influence and significance of oil in the 21st century is not what it was, in the 1970s and 80s. And so that did not materialize either. And I think it also exposed Kurdistan politically, economically, and militarily. And unfortunately, those weaknesses today remain. As I mentioned earlier, Iran attacks KRG routinely, Turkey attacks it routinely, and now the militias attack them routinely. And the KRG seems not to even have the ability to deter and at points even condemn these attacks clearly. So it has really exposed Kurdish weaknesses. And I think the other unfortunate aspect about this is that even today, several years after the referendum in Kurdistan, because the parties themselves, KRG and Kurdistan lost half of the territory, and again suffered those political, economic, and security and reputational aspects that I mentioned. Today, it's very difficult in Kurdistan to talk about and evaluate the referendum and have the kind of conversation that we are having right now, like what went right and what was wrong, because the conversation about the referendum is very partisan. So if you say that the referendum was, not a good idea, then therefore you're labeled with one party. And then if you want to show loyalty, you have to say that it was, the best decision ever, and it was the world and the cosmos's fault, nothing that the Kurds could have done. But having a serious conversation as to why the Kurds made that decision, why at that time, what were the messaging, where did the communication falter, what did the US say? I have not seen like a serious conversation. So there could be a teachable moment even for Kurdish, national aspirations. So I think the one probably downside that to me is going to linger for the long term is, while Kurdistan suffered so much and lost so much, the two political parties that were responsible for the referendum and then the failure of the referendum hasn't really lost much. They remain in power. The key leaders who were responsible for the whole episode in the Kurdish history actually consolidated their influence. But at the same time, I think Kurdish governance, the Kurdish reputation, one time was being called the other Iraq because of the stability, the democratic progress, and the greater level of democracy and freedom. Unfortunately, the KRG is taking steps back from all of these shiny points that made the KRG stand out. So today, you hear about greater level of corruption, you hear about economic dysfunction, you hear about journalists going to prison, you hear about curtailing freedom of speech and discussion about these issues that I have mentioned. So the challenges seem to get bigger, but the Kurdish ability to really withstand them is shrinking, and the Kurdish leaders are becoming more thin-skinned about criticism. And that's what I kind of referred to earlier as to a vision as to where the KRG wants to go, where the KRG wants to be in 5 years and 10 years is very much missing, because the two parties are very much engaged right now and busy. And to me, this is the most important, I think, source of instability. The parties, rather than looking at the Kurdish aspiration or how do we recover from the referendum and where do we go next? Do we invest in regional relations with Iran and Turkey, etc., or do we invest in Iraqi politics? I think the main focus and political capital is internal KDP and PUK, and I would argue not even the parties, but the family. So much of to me, the most stabilizing element is this transition of power within the Barzani and the Talabani family. And the political capital consumed on that is really clouding the judgment of the leaders to kind of see beyond that and be able to really recover from the referendum, from the Iran attacks, from the kind of this 30 years since 1992, as I mentioned, KRG turns 30 in May. So just to have kind of take a step back and say, what did we do right? And there is a lot that were done right. And then what did we do wrong? And how can we right those wrongs and basically start afresh and move forward? Now, is that going to be investing more in Iraq? I think that's what Western powers, and including Washington, wants KRG to do, to be a source for stability in Iraq. But the KRG, so far, the Kurdish leaders have this kind of schizophrenic policy toward Iraq. On the one hand, they want independence, and they tried that. But on the other, they are very much dependent on Iraqi finances, Iraqi oil, and now increasingly on Iraq being able to protect KRG from international aggressions, regional aggressions, state-to-state aggressions, and that would be Turkish military incursions into KRG territory, as well as Iranian ballistic missiles.
Incredibly comprehensive discussion there, from the intra-Kurdish tensions and rivalries all the way up to the regional dynamics. And obviously we see this new military offensive by Turkey in northern Kurdistan having, something we often see in the spring, but something that will certainly have an important set of effects that we should be following. So we have limited time, so I'm going to ask the final three panelists to be as brief as they can in their responses. We've gotten through an immense amount of material already. I'm going to take a question from the audience for Dilan, and this is actually about anti-Kurdish racism. And the audience member wants to know sort of why is there so much anti-Kurdish racism in Turkey? Obviously, this is a huge question. But if you were able to tie that maybe to, for example, the fact that we have 6 opposition parties coming together in Turkey for the elections next year, and yet the People's Democratic Party was not included in that, and there's a belief that this sort of Turkish nationalism is preventing that inclusion. So sort of why do we see this Kurdish antipathy, and is there anything that sort of external allies can do to support the Kurdish cause? I know that's a ton of topics, but let's see what you can do with it.
Okay, thank you for the question. Yeah, Bilal's answer was very, very comprehensive. I'm going to keep it shorter and more specific to the question. So the question is, okay, because Turkish nationalism is the official state ideology in Turkey. And we have to remember that there are different, like there are varieties of Turkish nationalism. There is Kemalist nationalism. There is AKP version of nationalism. There is typical MHP version of nationalism. And not all of them are excessively or extremely violent. So there are also these hidden, subtle forms of Turkish nationalist aspirations in Turkey. So that's one of the reasons, and I think, as I said, it ties back to my first, I think, comments, opening remarks. Because it is embedded within this institutional paradigm, this kind of mindset, logic, it is hard for political actors to detach themselves from the core of it, the core of this mentality, which is nationalism. Again, it is more like a cement that brings different Turkish groups together. And there are also some Kurds maybe who also support that because they're already assimilated and co-opted, because co-optation is used as another instrument in the fight against also PKK, but also Kurds in general. So the second part is like those leftist parties. So, okay, just 2 sentences, I think. I mentioned the institutional level, and I tried to make this kind of institutional level analysis in the first question, but I think we should also think about the societal level, and these two go together, and these two feed each other, okay? So there are lots of racist incidents where you become target because your neighbors are working for the state, more like paramilitaries, okay? They are collecting information about you, or your friends, so-called friends in the school, in the university, may work for intelligence services. So we have to, if you're a member of a minority group or a stateless nation, this is an expression from my fieldwork, and I'm going to use it, and I'm going to stop there. It came from a politically active lawyer who is now living in exile. He was the head of HDP or BDP. By the time it was BDP, and then he was imprisoned, and then they released him, but they would put him in prison for a longer term, and he had to leave the country and went to Europe. Anyways, he said, living in Kurdistan, and I would say also Istanbul, is more like having 2 more eyes at the back of your head. You always have to watch your back. So I'm going to stop here.
Wow, equally comprehensive and really powerful. So thank you so much for sharing that. The last 2 questions that we have are sort of both the international regional dimension. So Shukriya, I'll go to you. How can we see the effect of US sanctions and the sort of pressure that has put on the Iranian regime? How does that impact Kurds? How does that impact the ability of Kurds to mobilize? Does it at all? Is this an opportunity? Is it a constraint? Sort of how do we see that international dynamic playing out on the Kurdish mobilization possibilities in Iran?
Actually, Kurdish in Iran, they are under the regime sanction for decades. The American sanction is not something new for us. So the Kurdish region is the most undeveloped region in the Iran, not just Kurdish region, because I explained in my previous answer for your first question about how these ethnic groups region are the most undeveloped regions. So for the Kurds, there are like we call it securitization of the ethnic groups region and securitization region of the Kurds happening in Iran since the establishment, because the both regime, the previous regime in Iran and the Islamic regimes, they have a common policy regarding the Kurdish in Iran, which is to keep them undeveloped and to keep these regions have a largest rate of unemployment, and the rate of the poverty is large. Why in the securitization discourse, when you study why they're doing that, there are a few goals for that kind of the policy, to force these region people, the young people, to migrate to the different part of the country, mostly in the central cities. In that part, they will find them as a cheap labor for that central cities, because they will pay low pay for that labor, and then they will look for the seasonal job in the central city. And then another part, because most of the Kurdish region are mobilized, like based on the data of the UN Human Rights Watch, after 1996 until today, the largest part of Iran that RGC's member they have a basis is a Kurdish region. In after 1996, Iran sent more than 200,000 the RGC member to that part of the country. So you can see it's more securitized region of the country. And I want to just, in the show, because we don't have a time, I want to talk about the Kurdish rivalry among the Iranian Kurds, which I think we have a fiercer rivalry among that part of the Kurdistan. If I want to compare with a different part of the Kurdistan, the Kurds in Iran, they have a coalition among all main parties of this part of the Kurdistan, and this coalition, they are agreed for one solution for future of Iran, which is democracy and decentralization power in this country based on the federalism system. And even it's important to mention, for the first time in Iran, 12 to 13 opposition party of Iranian, they have a coalition, and this was initiated by Kurdish parties. So you can see Kurds in this country, they just not fight for themselves, they fight for the future of the country, because they never asked for what Iranian regime and the regime related elites, they always like have that kind of labeling Kurd for being a separatist, foreign agent, being feeding by America, Israel, and this kind of the fake argument. But when you see the reality of the policy of the Kurdish party, they don't hide their goal and their strategy for the future of Iran. They always asking for freedom and democracy for all Iranian, and they never ask to be a separate from the Iran. So it is what we have to mention, that when you hear about the other party, when they talk about how ethnic groups become a tool for the foreigner to interfere Iranian domestic policy. There's a lot of stuff to talk about how Iran play in the region, is one of the regional powers. So Iran's role in the Iraq, Syria, even in Turkey, Dylan have a great question about it. What is Iran's role in the Turkey's domestic policy? We know after, I will just make a short in this part. We know after Syrian support for the PKK against Turkey in 1980s, we have that strategy is my enemy's enemy is my friend. So Assad supported PKK against Turkey, and then Iran's relation with the PKK started from that point. I can say Iran learned that strategy from the Syria, from the Assad family, when for first time, based on the Congress document, Iran asked Barzani to open place for the PKK to open the bases in Iraqi Kurdistan in 1980s. So you can say how the Barzani and PKK's relation started by Iran's proposal. And now even we have that tension between these two Kurdish main groups. These two groups is, I do believe, and based on the evidence we have, Iran pushed this disputed between two main groups against the Kurdish interests in the Middle East. Unfortunately, we don't have that much time. I will stop here, and hopefully in the next events, we will have more time to go deep about that kind of the detail about rivalry between Kurdish groups.
Thank you so much for that. And we don't have a hard stop time. So anyone who can stay on with us, please do. And I just want to say this is exactly why I wanted to put all of you into discussion, because you're building on each other's points and drawing those regional dynamics and cross-border dynamics and rivalry dynamics, and in just such a comprehensible and digestible and accessible way. So I just want to say thank you so much for that. So Shirwan, we turn to you for the last question. So actually, there is a question about as we see in a lot of contexts, how will Russia's war in Ukraine sort of affect Kurds' role in Syria? Has Russia, turned its focus all the way to Ukraine? What does that have to do with Assad's power? All those kinds of dynamics that you can take on if you want. And if you want to take on the question of intra-Kurdish rivalries as well, the Democratic Union Party, the Kurdish National Council, feel free to take, whatever time that you want, because again, we don't have a hard deadline and I want to give you as much floor as possible. So however you want to address those questions, the floor is yours.
Sure, thank you, Lisel. I will start with Russia. Yeah, Russia is still there. Russia sees Syria as a long-term strategic project, so Russia will not abandon Syria because of what's happening in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine does, the war in Ukraine does affect Russia's operations on the ground. For example, a couple of days ago, I saw reports of Russia cutting the salaries of its elements within the Syrian army, the fifth division, for example, by half. So before the war, they were getting paid $200 monthly. Right now, the salary is cut by half, which is $100. So that you see things like that get impacted, and it will continue to, deteriorate for the Syrians supported by Russia, those elements within the military in particular, but also how Russia sees the Kurdish region. Just recently, we witnessed an incident in which the Syrian regime imposed a blockade on 2 Kurdish neighborhoods in Aleppo. In return, Kurdish security forces in Qamishli, all the way in the northeast, imposed a similar blockade on the so-called security zones in the city of Qamishli. And these are small areas, a radius of 1 mile probably, where you see all the government functioning and dysfunctioning organizations that are based there. Russia, in return, threatened the Kurds, the SDF namely, that if you don't make any concessions in this dilemma, then you will have to deal with Turkey and Turkish-backed groups alone. We're not gonna be here to defend you. So this takes me to the second point, in the sense that Syrian Kurds have been managing a very, very delicate security arrangement for the past several years, particularly since the October 2019 partial use withdrawal from the region, which ultimately allowed the Turkish invasion, the second Turkish invasion of Rojava. And but since then, the Syrian elements of the Syrian government and the Russians were invited by the SDF. They had to make that tough call to the region to prevent the Turks from further expanding into the northeast, because that was the idea. And but since then, you have, in a very small geographic region, different powers vying for different ways of control. You have the Americans, of course, who are solely focused on continuing the battle against ISIS. You have the Turks that want to expand, Turks and their proxy, of course, and you have the Syrian regime and the Russians that want to make a huge comeback, and you have the Kurdish region, the Kurdish group, the main Kurdish group, the Ph.D. and SDF, that wants to protect this region, and like I said before, the very existence of this experiment. And so the fact that the region is still there, partially the same it was in 2012, because on the other hand, the Kurds have expanded in places like Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor. So if we're talking about geographic control, the Kurds probably control the same region, if not a little more, more than the region that they once controlled in the outset of the Syrian conflict. Still, it's very challenging, because you're trying to manage all these different groups with their different interests in the region. And by that, I've always argued, well, first of all, I might sound like a broken record to those who know me, but Kurdish politics in Syria are never local. Every time there's something, you see an interest from regional powers, but also from regional Kurdish actors, namely the KRG, the Kurdistan Regional Government. Within that government structure, you have the KDP and also the Kurdistan Workers' Party. And Kurdish politics over the decades have been, Kurdish politics in Syria over the decades have been influenced heavily by these two main political powerhouses, the KDP and the PKK. And so for that to, it's manifested almost on a daily basis in Syria, the way that the PYD, the SDF, and the YPG deals and treats other non-PYD political groups, namely the Kurdish National Council, KNC, and those smaller parties that are really outside the structure of the PKK. But I argue that for this experiment to continue, to exist, but also to sustain it in the future, the PYD and SDF need to be more open. They need to be their institutions that they've been building, but make it more democratic, allow more political participation from other non-PYD SDF Kurds, and allowing other ethnic groups to join this experiment. Although that's what's been happening, but it needs to happen on a larger scale, because that's really what the PYD, what everybody else is counting on: Kurdish fragmentation, and that's something not new and not unique to Syria, and definitely will continue to play out in the long term in Syria. But the more these groups, the Syrian regime, ISIS and others remain a threat, the more pressing this issue is to try to, close that rift and try to manage that rivalry between these Kurdish groups that are supported by different Kurdish regional players.
Outstanding. Thank you so much. I think Dr. Wahab is being tapped out. So he's being told this is the end of the session. So Shirvan, Shukriya, Dilan, Bilal, thank you so much. This has been an incredibly rich discussion. We could go on for hours. I wish we could. I hope we can at some point in the future have you for future events, hopefully in person. But we were able to get great reach with this event. So thank you to my distinguished panelists. Thank you to those of you who joined us. And thank you to the SAIS MENA Club for organizing. Thank you so much.
Thank you
for having us.
Much,
Good to be with you.